A young mother picked up her son from the babysitter and headed home, but she never reached her destination. Police launched an investigation, uncovering a series of unexpected clues and witness statements. Despite this, the search for the truth dragged on for decades, and when the case was finally solved, it caused a massive uproar due to some very disturbing details. Stacy Ann Falcon Dewey was born on October 23, 1971, in Renton, Washington. She grew up there with her parents and older brother, though her father left the family shortly after she was born. Stacy was cheerful, outgoing, and had many friends. In high school, she met a guy named John, and they started dating. After graduation, the couple decided to move to California, and sometime later, their son Jacob was born. After living in another state for a few years, they decided to move back to their hometown. Soon after, her relationship with John began to decline, and eventually, the couple decided to separate. From then on, Stacy raised her son as a single mother. She got a job as a waitress, rented an apartment in a small complex, and worked hard to provide Jacob with everything he needed. In October 1994, when she was 22, Stacy was getting ready to celebrate her birthday. On October 23rd, she decided to surprise her mom and visited her with her son. Even though they lived in the same city, her mother's house was quite far away, so Stacy couldn't always find time to visit due to her work schedule. They celebrated her birthday, and then Stacy and her son drove home. 4 days later, on her next day off, she went out to celebrate with friends, leaving Jacob with a babysitter she knew. They visited a few places, had a great time, and late that night, she went to pick up her son. Stacy arrived at the sitters around 1:30 a.m., picked up Jacob, and headed home. About 2 hours later, a newspaper carrier started his morning route in the same area. Passing a short dead-end road, he saw a parked car with a woman and a young boy lying on the ground next to it. He immediately reported it to the police, and officers arrived on the scene with paramedics. They quickly determined that both victims were unresponsive, and visual signs indicated fatal injuries. Investigators also quickly identified the victims. It was Stacy and her son. Police began examining the crime scene, trying to determine what had happened. Near the car and inside the cabin, they found several casings, as well as Stacy's belongings, including her cell phone. The woman's shoes were found several yards away from the car, which detectives found very strange. It looked as if the perpetrator had removed their shoes for some reason. However, her wallet and jewelry were untouched, which immediately cast doubt on a robbery motive. Another odd detail was the discovery of white buttons at the scene that apparently didn't belong to either of the victims. The car keys were found wedged between the door and the driver's seat. Additionally, adhesive tape was found at the scene. Police theorized that the perpetrator initially planned to steal the car, leaving Stacy and Jacob bound, but couldn't find the keys. After the victims were transferred to medical examiners, they confirmed the cause of passing was fatal injuries caused by a device. Stacy also had many defensive wounds, indicating she had tried to fight off the attacker. Mud on her socks and flattened grass near the car also pointed to this. Based on the investigators' theory, Stacy may have broken free from the perpetrator and jumped into the car. However, she didn't have time to drive away. The attacker used the weapon, ending both their lives, and then dragged them onto the road. Medical examiners initially found no direct evidence of physical violation, which ruled out that motive at the time. Finishing with the crime scene, police began canvassing the neighborhood, hoping to find witnesses. Several people reported waking up around 2:11 a.m. to a woman's scream and loud noises, but none of them felt the need to call the police. The area was considered unsafe, so local residents didn't think much of the sounds. In any case, none of them could provide any useful information. Given all the available information, police decided to rule out two main motives: robbery and physical assault. They focused on finding suspects within Stacy's inner circle and went to speak with her mother. That morning, her mother was at work at a cafe, and detectives broke the heartbreaking news to her. The woman was beside herself with grief. She ran out of the cafe and down several streets before collapsing on the ground in tears. When police finally managed to calm her down, they began asking if anyone might have wanted to harm her daughter. First, they learned that Stacy had briefly lived in the same apartment complex as the babysitter where she had left Jacob. However, she decided to find a new place after hearing loud shots near the building one day. Since then, she lived in a different area, but occasionally left her son there with the sitter she knew. Her mother then revealed that at the time of the tragedy, Stacy was dating a man named Rich. According to her, their relationship seemed quite normal and calm. Rich got along well with Jacob, and he lived separately from them most of the time. Detectives went to speak with him, and the man explained that he had spent that evening at a bar near Stacy's apartment complex. Late at night, he went to her place while she was still celebrating her birthday with friends and went to sleep because he didn't want to drive back to his own apartment. Rich claimed he woke up near morning and initially didn't think much of the fact that Stacy and Jacob weren't there. He thought maybe they came home while he was sleeping and left early without waking him. Rich denied any involvement in the tragedy and agreed to take a polygraph, but the results were inconclusive. The operator recorded several questionable responses, which forced police to keep him on the list of possible suspects. However, there was no direct evidence against him, and witnesses from the bar confirmed seeing him that evening. Additionally, investigators couldn't determine a motive, so they continued to look into Stacy's personal life. Detectives began looking at her ex-husband, Jacob's father. He said that evening he went out for drinks with friends, then returned home, played pool with a neighbor, and went to bed. His friends confirmed this story. However, as with Rich, the polygraph results were questionable. Still, there was no evidence against the ex-husband either. Forensics examined the car and all the victim's belongings, but found no third-party DNA or fingerprints. Thus, they had virtually no direct way to establish guilt. So, police continued digging into the case. Soon, they received a report from a local hospital about a suspicious man who came in the middle of the night with red stains on his clothes. Investigators immediately went to speak with him and seized his clothes for DNA analysis. The man claimed he had gotten into a fight with his girlfriend and had nothing to do with the Stacy case. However, police decided to detain him until lab results came back. Experts eventually confirmed that the biological traces did not belong to Stacy or Jacob, and the man was cleared as a suspect. Sometime later, detectives got another lead. They found out that before picking up her son, Stacy had stopped at a grocery store. Reviewing security footage, police saw her talking to a man there. However, they were never able to identify him. Another clue awaited them on the victim's phone. Investigators discovered the last incoming call was from a man named Scott. They went to speak with him, and he said he was home with his wife and kids that night. He also admitted that he had briefly dated Stacy in the past until she found out he was married. Since then, they remained friends, and his wife confirmed he was home the night of the tragedy. However, while investigating him, police noticed something suspicious. According to the victim's friends, Scott once left her a $100 tip at the cafe where she worked. Given that the man had a fairly low-paying job and a family, such spending seemed odd to investigators. Further investigation led to a theory that Scott might be involved in the trade of illegal substances. However, this didn't bring them any closer to solving Stacy's case. Police only had circumstantial evidence against Scott, so they kept him as a person of interest. For the next few weeks, police unsuccessfully tried to find new evidence until an unexpected turn of events occurred. 2 weeks after the tragedy, police found Scott deceased in the trunk of an abandoned car. His brother told investigators that Scott was planning to visit an acquaintance named Vince that day. He and his brother did side jobs installing electronics, and Scott had recently installed an expensive audio system in Vince's car, but Vince never paid. Scott planned to confront him for the money, and the brother believed Vince was responsible for his disappearance. Police found Vince, and he denied any guilt. However, detectives found traces of Scott's biological material in his apartment and established he had used the deceased man's credit card. Eventually, the man was arrested, and detectives on the Stacy and Jacob case went to speak with him, hoping he might know something about Scott's potential involvement. However, this led nowhere. For the next several months, the case went cold. But shortly before his trial began, Vince suddenly decided to plead guilty. He insisted he committed the crime in self-defense because Scott threatened him. According to the man, that day Scott directly told him that he had taken Stacy's life because she threatened to tell his wife about their affair. Vince also added that he and Scott were involved in selling illicit goods. However, detectives were hesitant to take his word for it. The problem was that Vince's story sounded too convenient. Right before his own trial, he accused Scott of another crime and involvement in illegal business to justify his own actions as self-defense. Despite this, police had no other leads, so they continued looking for a link between Scott and Stacy. But the deeper they dug, the less plausible Vince's story seemed. Scott's wife insisted he was with her that night and couldn't have been on the other side of town. His brother also said he had never heard of an affair between him and Stacy, even though they always shared such details. Additionally, the brother claimed Scott had nothing to do with illegal trade, and they earned a living repairing cars. Thus, detectives concluded Vince's story was simply untrue and intended only to avoid punishment for his own crime. From then on, there was almost no movement in the case. Over time, it was shelved, and the only person who continued seeking answers was Stacy's mother. She regularly contacted detectives, but sooner or later, they all retired or transferred to other departments. Once, she was told the investigation would be transferred to a cold case unit in Seattle. But when she tried to contact them, it turned out the unit had been disbanded due to lack of funding. In the early 2000s, police suddenly received information about a new suspect, An inmate contacted investigators, claiming his acquaintance, a man named Charles, confessed to involvement in the Stacy and Jacob case. According to the informant, the man worked with the woman at a cafe, and they were involved in selling banned substances together. However, Stacy decided to turn him in, which led to the tragedy. The story seemed like a stretch to detectives, but with no other leads, they decided to investigate Charles. Police sent all available evidence to the lab for reanalysis, hoping modern tools would find DNA traces. But there was a problem. The lab was overloaded, so they had to wait a whole year for results. Nevertheless, in 2002, detectives finally got an answer. Experts managed to find DNA on gloves and tape found at the scene, and they got a match, but not with Charles. It matched the genetic profile of a completely different man who had never been on the police radar during those years. It was Jerome Jones, whose name hadn't even appeared in the case files. Police began looking into him and learned Jones had an extensive criminal history dating back to his teens. He had been involved in robbery, assault, car theft, and illegal substances. In '95, a year after the tragedy with Stacy and Jacob, Jones and an accomplice took the life of a businessman outside his home in California, and in 1998, he was sent to prison. Police also learned that in '94, Jones lived in the very same apartment complex where Stacy left her son with the sitter and from where she had moved due to safety concerns. Moreover, he worked at the club where the woman celebrated her birthday with friends. Detectives went to another state to interview the man, but he claimed to have no connection to the case. All subsequent attempts to get him to talk failed. But reanalysis of the DNA confirmed that the biological material found on items at the crime scene indeed belonged to him. However, there was a problem. The presence of DNA on gloves and tape was considered circumstantial evidence, and police knew securing a conviction would be difficult. Detectives then requested an analysis of biological samples taken from the victims in the early days of the investigation. These were still in storage, and this time, experts made progress. In samples from Stacy, they found biological material belonging to Jones. This was not only additional confirmation of his involvement, but also evidence of a personal attack. Later, experts finished examining other samples and found Jones's DNA under the victim's fingernails, further linking him to the crime. Gathering all this information, detectives went to the prosecutor to discuss filing charges. However, an unexpected complication arose. The prosecutor felt the existing evidence might not be enough to directly link Jones to the double tragedy. For this reason, he asked experts to reconstruct the crime scene, taking the new evidence into account, to try and visually demonstrate the man's involvement. But then, for some unclear reason, the case effectively froze. It's unknown if the prosecutor's request for reconstruction was fulfilled, but ultimately, Jones was never charged. Perhaps investigators didn't rush because the man was already incarcerated for another crime, or they felt the evidence was insufficient for a conviction. As a result, the case was shelved again, despite having multiple DNA matches. Crucially, police simply didn't tell Stacy's mother about this, even though she had been trying to get any progress for years. This went on for decades. The woman tried contacting investigators, but over time, they all changed, and she effectively lost contact with anyone responsible for the investigation. Eventually, the mother tried to find answers herself, studying all available information with her sister. This went on for about 15 years until her sister passed away from an illness in 2017. Since then, the woman continued seeking answers alone, but all her attempts to get justice led to dead ends. In 2019, a journalist from Seattle became interested in the case. He contacted Stacy's mom and began diving into the investigation. Eventually, the journalist discovered that police had found a DNA match on the victim's body over 15 years ago and was shocked that Jones had never been charged. He told Stacy's mother, and the information devastated her. She couldn't believe that for all that time, police had a suspect linked to the case by multiple DNA samples. The journalist contacted a detective who worked on the force in those years and asked why they hadn't notified the victim's mother about the match. He replied that the evidence seemed too complicated to draw final conclusions. Plus, at the time, he was working on many cases and simply didn't have the time. The journalist then asked the prosecutor the same question, who replied that it wasn't his duty to inform victims' relatives of developments, so the thought never even crossed his mind. Finally, the journalist put all the information together and published a story. The piece caused a massive public outcry, bringing Stacy and Jacob's story to the attention of current detectives. Reviewing the evidence collected by their predecessors, they were also surprised Jones hadn't been charged and began preparing the case for trial. Around this time, they faced a rather unpleasant turn of events. Jones, who was still serving time for the other crime, became eligible for parole, even though he was supposed to be behind bars until at least 2030. Detectives and the prosecution had to hurry to ensure the man didn't walk free. By early 2022, they finally filed official charges, and the man was arrested immediately after being released from prison in California. He was extradited to Washington and placed in custody awaiting trial. Sadly, Stacy's mom never lived to see the moment the person responsible for the loss of her daughter and grandson would face punishment. She passed away 4 months after Jones's arrest. Despite this, the prosecution planned to see the case through and get justice for Stacy and her son. Based on all available evidence, they presented their theory of what happened that night. They believe Jones attacked the woman almost immediately after she left the babysitters. He either forced her to stop the car by threatening her with a weapon, or she stopped for some reason, and Jones approached her. According to the prosecutor, the man's initial goal was carjacking. However, during the crime, he decided to assault Stacy. He forced her out of the car and bound her hands, but she managed to break free. In the struggle, she ran to the car where her son had been the whole time, and Jones inflicted fatal injuries on them. He then dragged the victims onto the road, planning to leave in the car, but couldn't find the keys wedged between the seat and door. He fled the scene, leaving multiple samples of his DNA behind. At preliminary hearings in May 2023, Jones pleaded not guilty, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. As of now, it hasn't started, and Jones remains behind bars. However, with the evidence at hand, there is virtually no doubt of his involvement, and if convicted, he faces a life sentence. Thus, this case is nearing its logical conclusion, though it took 3 decades. Yet theoretically, Jones could have been charged back in 2002, 8 years after the tragedy. But for unknown reasons, it took 20 years. Even though the man spent that time in prison anyway, Stacy's mom lived in the dark, suffering for years from the fact that she couldn't get justice for her daughter and grandson. And now, when Jones might finally be officially found guilty, she won't see the verdict. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you found it interesting. Thanks for watching.